people who we're all familiar with: Monet, Manet, Cezanne, Renoir, Degas, Cassatt. Yeah, I wrote them all down. This is an Impressionist painting by an African-American man, Henry O. Tanner, who spent most of his career in Paris. And I'm a little sad that I never heard of him before looking into Daniel in the Lion's Den, because he wasn't just an Impressionist artist and well recognized in his day. He was a deeply Christian man who painted many biblical scenes like this. And they're quite moving. I encourage you to look him up, Henry O. Tanner. And that's all I have to say about that. So, our sermon today is about what happens, well, maybe it's not, but let's ask this question in our heads. What happens when an immovable object meets an irresistible force? We've all heard of that question, right? Is there some sort of explosion? That was my first thought when this question came to mind. Does that force just destroy itself? Does the immovable object phase in and out of existence so that the force can go through it? That was a theory of one guy on Reddit that I read this week. Because yes, Googled it. Well, in theory, what happens is they cancel each other out, so nothing would happen. But actually, it's a trick question because there's no such thing as an immovable object or an irresistible force, at least in physics. In nature, I should say. You have to go to the supernatural to get anything like that. But in our story today, we do have a chance to see what happens when the immutable, unchangeable law of God is the irrevocable law of the Medes and Persians. And we can also see in this story a dramatic parallel in the account of the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus, which I wasn't expecting when I read through this story. So let's begin. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." Our story picks up with our hero Daniel, and if you were here last week, you remember this. Daniel was at a very high government level when he was left by Belshazzar in chapter 5. Even though Belshazzar the king didn't live for another day, but he's still very high up there. He's been made one of 3 administrators, placed over 120 satraps, which you can think of as like governors of different areas. And the king is thinking of bringing him to an even higher status because of his exceptional qualities. Whatever these qualities may have been, it brought out jealousy from the other 2 administrators as well as those 120 satraps, who evidently didn't have exceptional qualities. So let's note that the satraps were made accountable to the 3 administrators so that the king, it says back there, so that the king might not suffer loss. And I read this to say that 2 of the administrators would let these guys get away with stuff, turn a blind eye, maybe even open their own wallets when the satraps took in a little more than they gave the king. But these guys won't be able to operate the way they want to if Daniel gets put in charge. So they need to prevent that from happening. So first they try to find something to hang on Daniel because, well, isn't that the way the world works? But finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man, Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God." So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now your majesty issued a decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. What a clever plan. They couldn't find any corruption in Daniel, so they found a way to set up this clash between two immutable laws. They're confident that Daniel will not side with the law of the Medes and Persians if that meant violating the law of God. I told you that the story of Daniel actually prefigures Jesus, and it starts with this conspiracy to trap him. Remember in the story of Jesus how Caiaphas, the high priest, and the chief priest, and the Sanhedrin brought Jesus' faithfulness to his own mission into conflict with the laws and customs that these religious leaders represented. This was to prepare the way for Jesus' trial and execution. And in Daniel's story, the satraps had set everything up the same way so that Daniel would be trapped. Both Daniel and Jesus were caught in a conspiracy. The officials all knew that Daniel was faithful to God above everything else, so they made that faithfulness illegal. And King Darius didn't think it through, partly because he had been deceived by them. They told them everyone agreed, but of course Daniel hadn't. And probably partly because of ego. You know, oh, of course, everyone should pray to me. I'm the man. So, continuing. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree? We kind of remember this the other day, that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, well, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. Well, the irresistible force is just not the immovable object, or the immutable law meets the unchangeable God. Daniel prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. Jesus, too, is taken by soldiers as he was in prayer with his father in the Garden of Gethsemane. Judas knew he would be. Daniel doesn't make a big deal out of disobeying King Darius' decree. He didn't, show off or anything. Just like Jesus didn't answer the accusations against him during his trial. Daniel continued his usual practice. He prayed and he gave thanks. Daniel did not ask to be a martyr, but when he's threatened, he remains steady. Being an observant and obedient Jew is both his downfall and, as we'll see, his salvation. After Jesus was arrested in Gethsemane, he was taken to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. They were ready for him. The Jewish religious authorities quickly gathered to interrogate Jesus, and they found him guilty of violating their laws. Blasphemy, in fact. Then the Sanhedrin established a case to accuse Jesus of violating Roman law. The Romans allowed the Jews to do some of their own jurisdiction, legal matter, trials. However, they kept the death penalty for themselves. So the high priest apparently knew how to frame someone who was a threat to his power by staying in cahoots with the Roman governor. The accusers of Jesus can trap him only by reporting to the Roman authorities about his messianic title, King of the Jews. So, going on with our story of Daniel. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as The men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict of the king issues can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. The king was greatly distressed because he cares about Daniel. He works for his release until at last he has no choice. With great misgivings, he's forced by his own law to see Daniel executed. During Jesus' trial, Pontius Pilate's wife warns her husband of Jesus' innocence, and Pilate himself protests Jesus' innocence to the crowd. In the end, however, he has to honor that law, his own law, that allows him to release to the crowd one condemned man whom they demand, and that was Barabbas. Pilate then washes his hands in Jesus' innocent blood. Darius came to do that. Finally, Daniel is executed, and his torture chamber / tomb is closed with a stone and sealed, just as Jesus is executed, and his tomb is closed with a stone and sealed. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" At the first light of dawn, after the Sabbath, remember that women hurried to Jesus' tomb, and they had even less hope than Darius had. The king, hurrying to the scene of Daniel's supposed death, continues to recognize that deliverance from these terrible circumstances could only be accomplished by the living God. And in fact, salvation has taken place. Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Now, 2 reasons are given for Daniel's salvation. Daniel says, "They have not hurt me, because I was found blameless before God." And we're also told it happened because he had trusted in his God. Blamelessness and trust. They're the key to successful survival in the face of overwhelming odds. Let's remember that there is a dependable order at work in the world. Human faithfulness is matched by God's incredible faithfulness. And that parallel with Jesus, that's there too. Both Jesus and Daniel were presumed dead, but both reappear from the tomb, vindicated by God's saving power. Now the comparison ends there because Jesus really did die. He was raised from the dead, whereas Daniel's daughter's angel shut the lion's mouth. And when he emerged from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in God. And Jesus trusted God too, but terrible, in fact, fatal wounds were found on Jesus. And God's victory over those wounds and death was therefore all the more overwhelming. The book of Daniel was written hundreds of years before Christ. The author of this book couldn't possibly have intended these parallels. The truth is the truth in all ages. Even though danger is extreme and the injustice is outrageous, God will prevail and will vindicate those who trust him. Now, of course, for many faithful people whose steadiness and trust should have earned them their safety, they had no angel to stop the lion's mouth, or to knock down the cross, or to keep them from martyrdom. And yet they too, in the power of their faith, have overcome the ultimate fear, the fear of death, and that their deaths would be meaningless, and their lives failures. Viewed from the perspective of God, God's coming victory. All faithfulness and all the good that has ever been done will be vindicated. From this point of view, the salvation of good and trust in Daniel from the lion's den is really an anticipation of our own rescue from destruction by God's transcendent power. Daniel's courage and trust are examples of how people are to behave faithfully while waiting for the Messiah, Jesus. Jesus' behavior is our guideline to how to wait for his second coming. Then the end of this story, you thought that was the end. No. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth. May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. The message of God's sovereignty that we've been talking about through this whole book of Daniel is all over this decree of Darius. This new decree offsets that previous one that started this whole business. Shutting lions' mouths is a powerful, godly act. We can't do it. But even more powerful is the response that God produced from King Darius. He changed him. That's nothing short of miraculous, that the king of the greatest empire in the world and a follower of God other than Daniel's God should sing this. This is really a poem, this hymn of faith. Who saved Daniel from the power of lions. Darius's confession is an act of God that's profoundly significant. This story, like the resurrection itself, is a foretaste of the coming victory of God over all enemies, even death itself. Death is no immovable object when it comes to God's irresistible force. And obviously, God has the power to close the mouths of lions whenever he wants. We need to remember here that the immutable human law also always threatens to trap its own makers. King Darius struggled desperately to free himself from the consequences of his decree, this hasty decree. Daniel is the free man in this story, and the king, even though he's a king, is trapped in the midst of the immutability of his own law. He's in bondage. If he had felt he was free to drop the idea that his law decree could not be changed, he might have gotten out of the bind he was in. But instead he chose to live out the lie. I suppose in fear of the satraps who already knew it was a lie, or at least knew how to manipulate it for their own good. We should never believe people who say that human decisions cannot be changed. Of course they can. When there are unjust or wrong human laws and human practices, they can always be changed, even though it may seem more dangerous to admit that than to risk the consequences of refusing to change. Well, this brings up this next question. Is God trapped by the immutability of his law? No. God's law is immutable and binding on us, yet God himself is greater than his own law. God's law is immutable, yet God himself can suspend it if compassion demands it. And that's what miracles are. I'm not making this up. It says that God can change the law even in the Bible. He says in Hosea, how can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? How can I treat you like Admah? How can I make you like Zeboim? My heart is changed within me. All my compassion is aroused. I will not carry out my fierce anger, nor will I devastate Ephraim again. For I am God and not a man, the Holy One among you. I will not come against their cities. God can do what God wants. He's never trapped like Darius was. The truth that God can do miracles should also be remembered in connection with Daniel's blamelessness, of course. And it's right to talk about his blamelessness. But God isn't forced to react to blamelessness. God acts in a larger scope as well. And this sets the stage for the coming vindication of all of God's children. The blameless may suffer in this world. We've seen that. And that happens if it's part of God's purposes. But we do well to remember that God is alive and well and is carrying out his purpose throughout the world. Let us serve him as faithfully